Thanks for having me back and welcome everyone. Um, this will work for those who've been to these programs before. Feel free to pop questions in the chat as we go along. This is a webinar, so you can't actually talk, but if you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them either in the chat or the Q&A, and I will keep an eye on them as we go through the program and try to answer them. And at the end of the program, I'll stick around as long as we need to answer any additional questions. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. And off we go. Yep, that looks good. Okay. So as Jeff said, this is a kind of a different program from the ones that I usually do because I'm often going to exotic destinations and Europe and Asia and elsewhere. And this is something I put together in 2020 because we were all stuck during COVID in various levels of lockdown. And we were unable to even leave Massachusetts at all. And even to go outside, we couldn't, going to a hotel, going to a restaurant, there were all kinds of things we couldn't do. So what I tried to do during that year, because it's very difficult for me not to travel, even if it means just walking down the street. We did a lot of day trips and a couple of short Airbnb stays, which during COVID were great because they were taking proper precautions. And instead of staying in a hotel with other people, Airbnbs were nice because you had your own private space and you could eat by yourself, get takeout food, and not maintain distance with people. So that was the kind of thing people were doing at that time. And Massachusetts is great. We're very lucky to be here. Massachusetts is a beautiful state. We have a tremendous variety of landscapes, geographical landscapes, natural landscapes, and also an incredible amount of historical heritage in very close by in such a small state. So I'm going to show you basically focus on three different places tonight. I've traveled, obviously, I grew up here, so I know plenty of Massachusetts. I've traveled all over the state. But I wanted to go at this particular time to places I hadn't been before or places I had never spent a lot of time. So I'm going to show you three different places. I'll get my pointer here. First, we're going to go down to the south coast, which is along Buzzards Bay. And then we're going to head up to the upper Pioneer Valley out in central Western Mass. And then at the end, we're going to take a quick stop in a place you may or may not have heard of called Purgatory Chasm, which is in the town of Sutton, just south of Worcester. None of these places are more than an hour and a half from Boston and the North Shore. So they're actually perfectly doable even in a day trip, not necessarily even as an overnight. But we did overnight trips for just a night or two, just to get away. And I'm going to start you on the south coast, which is very similar to the Cape, but rarely as crowded as the Cape. And obviously during COVID, it was hardly crowded at all. It centers on Buzzards Bay. And it has a number of beautiful seaside towns that don't always get the same level of tourism that the Cape towns do. And it also has the city of New Bedford and Fall River too, a little further inland, if you want historic cities. And the landscape down here where Dartmouth and Westport head into across the border into Rhode Island is very beautiful. It's broad and rural and sweeps down low towards the ocean, kind of makes you think of, in some ways, of parts of Britain. So we'll look all around this area. We stayed in an Airbnb in Fairhaven, which I must confess I knew very little about. I think I had been through Fairhaven once at some point in my life, but never spent any time there. And it's a very stylish town of about 16,000 people, right across the Acushnet River from Bedford, New Bedford. And historically, it was where wealthy people from New Bedford, back when that city was a major shipping and whaling port, wealthy people moved out of the city to be away from the larger city and moved just right across the harbor and built very beautiful houses in Fairhaven, just across the river. So it has a very busy harbor and some just gorgeous architecture. We stayed in this particular one called the Delano B&B, which has only a few rooms. I think it has 4 or 5 rooms. And we were the only people there at the time we stayed there. It has a gorgeous garden, very nice homemade breakfast. We stayed way up in the attic, in these nice little attic rooms. And the interior has been beautifully restored with period furnishings. This is a house kind of from the Italianate era in the 1840s or so. So it very much has that look to it, and they've restored it with furnishings appropriate to the period. The Delano of the name is in fact the Delano family of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His mother, Sarah Delano, that was her family. And in fact, President Roosevelt and Eleanor, his wife, stayed at this house a number of times during their lives. And it's just gorgeous inside, particularly when you have it all to yourself. So we would go off exploring the area and come back and have a sherry and or a cup of tea or something and read. There are several different guest rooms which are very nicely appointed, including the ones up in the attic. And I'm a sucker for a really nice bathroom. So this beautiful bathroom, this was our bathroom up in the attic, complete with a view. And in fact, the town hall, which we'll look at in just a minute, is right across the street. And that was built, this over-the-top confection of a building was built by a very wealthy donor named Henry Rogers. It was built in 1894. It has a huge auditorium upstairs. And when the building was dedicated in the mid-1890s, Mark Twain actually was the keynote speaker who came to give the address here to dedicate the building. Unfortunately, because of COVID, a lot of these buildings were closed to the public at the time. So I would love to go back someday just to see some of these buildings and have a chance to go and explore the interiors as well. The style of the building is called Renaissance Revival. And it has all these incredible details. And right across the street is another building similar in style, although a bit smaller and more delicate. This is the public library. Jess was mentioning the program that she's having tomorrow night about the history of public libraries in Massachusetts. And you'll see a few of them as we go through tonight's program, because we have some really beautiful buildings throughout the state. This is called the Millicent Library. And it was built by the exact same architect who designed the town hall across the street, and in a kind of similar style. And again, it has these beautiful little Renaissance details with carvings, tile roof. The Millicent of the name, it's actually Rogers, the philanthropist who funded all of this stuff. Millicent Rogers was his daughter. So that's why it's called the Millicent Library. Not far down the street, a little bit later in 1904, is this incredible English Gothic cathedral style church, which surprisingly is Unitarian. You wouldn't expect a Unitarian church to look like this, but it is. It was again designed and funded by that same crowd of people, the architects and the Rogers family, who very much made a mark in a lot of the public buildings in town. And it also has very elaborate details. It's very massive and very unusual for a Unitarian church, which tend to be more of the, usually are the white wooden clapboard church on the common that's so typical of New England. And there's even a very nice parish house, English style parish house that goes along with it right next door. Probably the most imposing building in the whole town is Fairhaven High School, which is at the north end of town. It's still used as the high school, although there's a big, much more modern addition in the back. Again, guess who? It was designed, built, and financed by all the same people, the Rogers family, same architect, and it was opened in 1906. And you would swear you were in, oh, I don't know, Belgium or the Netherlands or someplace like that. It's an absolutely fantastic building. And many of these buildings you can see, this is a view across the river from New Bedford on a nice foggy evening. And Fairhaven actually has a skyline. All of these beautiful buildings from 120 years ago or so make a beautiful vista across the harbor, because you can see the towers off in the distance. But it's also a really nice town just to stroll around. It doesn't have a lot of actual sites like New Bedford does. There's no big museums and big sights to see, but it's a delight to just walk around and look at a lot of beautiful, elegant homes from different eras, and all of them are very close to the ocean. Nothing in Fairhaven is more than a few blocks from the sea. We're actually going to see a lot of Gothic revival, like this house tonight. I was kind of surprised as we went around the South Coast, just how many Gothic revival houses there were. It's almost like there were traveling salesmen in the 1800s going around convincing people to build this style of house, because we don't have them as much. They're much less common up on the North Shore and in the Boston area, but they're all over the place down in the South Coast, as well as Georgian style mansions and federal style mansions and different other 19th century revival styles. And all of this is kind of lined up in streets that head down to the Acushnet River, which is what separates Fairhaven from New Bedford. You can see across to the city on the other side. Because we're so close to the ocean, of course, the whole area is at risk of sea level rise or just regular storms. So a lot of the more recent buildings very close to the shore, cottages like this one, are often built up on stilts like this for protection. You can actually walk all the way to the southern end of the peninsula that Fairhaven is on, where you get to a really nice park. There's a little beach there. And the remains of Fort Phoenix, which was the site of the very first naval battle in the Revolutionary War. The original fort on this site was destroyed by the British in 1778, and it was later rebuilt, hence the name. It's called Fort Phoenix because it rose again from the ashes. So there is the reconstructed fort that you can wander around and visit, and it has a beautiful view back up to the harbor with all the marinas and the pleasure boats, back up to the spires in downtown. You can see the church spire off in the distance and town hall and so forth. And if you look across the river, right across the mouth of the Acushnet River, you can see downtown New Bedford, which is obviously much bigger. New Bedford's probably 6 or 7 times as big as Fairhaven. But again, just strolling around the center of Fairhaven, I'm kind of surprised this isn't included in more travel guidebooks and so forth, because I would say it rivals Nantucket in terms of gorgeous architecture from different time periods. It really is stunning. This is one of the oldest houses in town from 1742. Beautiful beech tree in the front. And there's a very atmospheric cemetery down by the river that you can also visit. This is the Delano family tomb, the Delanos that are connected with Sarah Delano and the Roosevelt family, and connected with the Airbnb that we stayed in. There's obviously, of course, a lot of very wealthy, very nice new construction. This is not an old historic home. This is a much more recent one, but built in the shingle style, and you'll see a lot of this. Real estate prices are sky high in this part of Massachusetts. Not that that's unusual these days. Here's the little fire department, and just some more interesting details on houses around the town. Another good example of Gothic revival. This doesn't have all the little gingerbread stuff on it, details, but the general style and shape of the house with the really high dormers is an indication of very typical of Gothic revival, most of which was built in like the first half of the 19th century for the most part. And of course, being in Fairhaven, you can easily pop across the bridge in less than 10 minutes to see New Bedford, which has plenty of things to see. New Bedford's much bigger. It's the 6th largest city in Massachusetts with over 100,000 people, big Portuguese community. And back in its day, it was one of the world's biggest whaling ports in the whole world. And it's still, although whaling has been gone for well over a century, um, the port is still very active, both for pleasure craft and also for fishing. It's still a major fishing port today. And it's a lot of fun to kind of stroll around the working port to see all of the fishing boats coming and going. They also do fish processing in New Bedford as well. It's particularly nice if you walk around when it's foggy. This just seems very New England to me, fishing harbors with all the boats and the lights visible through the fog. There's even a Nantucket lightship there. I don't know if you know the history of the Nantucket lightships. There were several, actually, not just one. And they were used as lighthouses in particularly dangerous locations for shipping, but where it was impossible to build a lighthouse. Much of the waters around Cape Cod and the shallow areas around Buzzards Bay and Nantucket Sound, they're relatively shallow for shipping. And there are shoals, and there have been certainly plenty of shipwrecks until modern navigation came around. So back in those days, in particular locations, they would actually station a ship to serve as a floating lighthouse to warn people. And some of those ships still exist. This one is docked in New Bedford Harbor. You can still see it today. New Bedford is a very different kind of city from Fairhaven, but obviously it has its own history and plenty of also very beautiful architecture, including a very nicely restored downtown. New Bedford's done a lot of work trying to promote tourism and come back from its kind of hardscrabble history. So in recent years, it's seen quite a renaissance with historic sites being renovated and lots of shops and restaurants. There's antique shops now. A lot of historic buildings have been turned into guest houses. And of course, if you have not been to the Whaling Museum, you must go. That makes a very easy day trip from the Boston area. And it's one of the best museums in Massachusetts. It focuses specifically on the whaling industry and products related to whaling and the history of the city of New Bedford. It's an absolutely fantastic place. And the harbor is just a delight to stroll around. It's also the starting point for lots and lots of boat trips if you want to head to Nantucket or the Vineyard. We took a trip to a place we had never been before, which is Cuttyhunk Island. And I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's a little harder to get to, so not as many people go there. It makes a wonderful day trip. And I'll show you a little bit closer on how it fits into the geography around here. It takes about an hour from New Bedford, which is up here, and you can take a boat directly to Cuttyhunk here. It is part of the chain of the Elizabeth Islands that stretches out from Woods Hole through all of these, this stretch of islands. Collectively, they form the municipality, the town of Gosnell. But with the exception of Cuttyhunk, they're all privately owned by the Forbes family, the wealthy Forbes family, as in Forbes magazine and Steve Forbes and all of that. So you can't actually visit any of these other islands that are technically part of the same town. But Cuttyhunk is the one place you can visit. The whole town only has about 50 residents total. So it feels very much like a world apart, even though you can easily see the mainland. It's 10, 12 miles off the coast. But there are almost no cars on the island. Some beautiful houses. Not too many large houses. Most of the buildings are smaller cottages. There's a few vehicles on the island for locals, but most of the locals actually use electric golf carts, which makes it a nice, a less busy place to be. You can just stroll around the village, admire the typical Cape and island style architecture with the shingles, and there's really no traffic, so it's a very pedestrian oriented place. This particular large building, it looks like a mansion, but it's a hotel. It was originally built as a summer home in 1909. It's called the Avalon. But for many decades in recent years, it has been turned into a nonprofit, and it's run as an inn for both tourists and also guest physicians, because there's so few people on Cuttyhunk that it is worth their while to have physicians there, particularly during the summer months when there's more people there, and this is a place they can stay. And you can stay there as well if you like. It's perched way up on a bluff with a view over the ocean. Although, to be honest, there's almost no place on Cuttyhunk that doesn't have a view of the ocean because it's so small. There's a wonderful little small cemetery, very traditional New England style cemetery. And you can walk around almost the entire island. It's only a mile and a half long. And there are nice walking paths. You can walk along the beach and inland out to the far end. There is a very well protected harbor. And the whole island has the same feel that you have if you go to Nantucket or you go to Martha's Vineyard or Cape Cod. But it's kind of a microcosm of that because it's such a small place. Here's the post office. And I promised you public libraries. Here's Gosnold's. This is Town Hall, but right next to it is the public library, which you can see here, which was getting a complete renovation when we were there. And in fact, we peeked through the windows because it was still under construction, but directly behind this front doorway, there's a huge window that looks out over the over Nantucket Sound, and I can just imagine curling up with a book in that window and watching the sea. And right behind it is the little schoolhouse for the town of Gosnold. This is actually a view inside the library, where the librarian's desk is. There's also a church. This tiny little Methodist church is from 1881. But it now, although it was built as a Methodist church, it now runs interfaith services because it's really the only church on the island. And this is the interior with a very soothing New England look to it. And I should point out these mosaics on either side of the altar are entirely made out of clamshells by a local artist, which is kind of an interesting little local twist on the decoration. And a view over the harbor with the nearest island. Nashawina Island is the next closest island. There's a very narrow strait in between the two of them. And way off in the distance, you can see the far western end of Martha's Vineyard, a few miles away. It is kind of strange to be on Cuttyhunk because you can see the mainland, you can see Martha's Vineyard, you can see the other islands in the Elizabeth chain, but you really feel completely isolated from all of it. It's an unusual spot, but this harbor is very nice. There's it's actually known as Cuttyhunk Pond, but it's the harbor where a lot of the local boats are moored and where the ferry comes in. Of course, being out on the ocean, there's plenty of bird life to see. If you like bird watching, Cuttyhunk is a great spot to go. And it has a very typical coastal landscape for New England that's ideal for walking. Here's the light department and the local marina. You can stay overnight, as I mentioned, on Cuttyhunk. You do have to do a little planning for that, but you don't have to. If you plan it right, it makes an easy day trip. If you're already down in New Bedford or Fairhaven, in that area, it's a very easy day trip. The boat would head out in the morning. You have several hours there, and it comes back in the mid-afternoon. I like the sign here that the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting happens every year, BYOB. Obviously a joke. As is this. One of the local restaurants is open 4-ish to 8-ish every day. Here is the ferry that takes you back to the mainland, right by the Coast Guard station. And off in the distance, you can see this is Martha's Vineyard, and in fact, this is Gatehead, that now known as the town of Aquina, with the lighthouse and the bluffs a few miles away. On a clear day, the view is very, very clear from there. And this is looking back to what you might call downtown Cuttyhunk, such as it is. Here's a closer view of the Gayhead Lighthouse in Aquina. And it's about maybe 5 miles, give or take, across the water. And a close-up of the old Coast Guard station. Back on the mainland, if you take the boat back, it's about an hour back to New Bedford. There's a number of other seaside towns that I just want to take you through. If you go up along the coast, heading east towards the Cape from Fairhaven, the main towns are Mattapoisett, Marion, and Wareham. And again, if you like beautiful New England towns and beautiful seaside architecture, there's no shortage of it. There's some it's a very nice drive. And there are lots of little narrow spits of land heading out into Buzzards Bay that you can explore, that have harbors and beaches and historic neighborhoods, and some incredible mansions. Some new, some old, and all different styles. One of the things I like about this area, and New England in general, is how many different styles of American architecture there are, from colonial times up through the 19th century and Victorian style houses, right up into the 20th century. And again, in just a couple of hours, you can poke your way through all of these towns along the coast, stopping for lunch or dinner. There's not a lot of major sites, things like museums and attractions, but it's just a beautiful area to explore and see things like the local town hall in Mattapoisett. Marion, the town of Marion next door, actually does have a natural history museum, which is here. Of course, any of the attractions we might want to have seen were closed during COVID at this time. So at some point, I'll get back down and see some of these things for real. Typical Cape Cod style houses and beautiful churches. This was one of my favorites. This is a town called Rochester, which is a bit inland. And you would never go to Rochester for any particular reason. It's the kind of town you would drive through. But I just loved this Gothic Revival Congregational Church, which is the main church on the common in the center of the village. And again, I mentioned Gothic Revival here. Here's another one, very simple style house, but with the very tall gable in the center. There's another one with an unusual color scheme. And an example of an Italianate style house, which is a little bit later. These were mostly built during the 1840s to 1860s, 70s. To emulate a very Italian Renaissance-y style. And if you go inland far enough, you will even see some cranberry bogs. Massachusetts is one of the largest producers in the country of cranberries, with about 300 individual cranberry growers. And overall, it comprises about 25% of the total production of cranberries in the United States. The year before all of this was a particularly bad year for cranberries because of the drought, but they still produced about 2 million barrels throughout the course of the year. I think the largest producer of cranberries, interestingly, is Wisconsin, which may surprise you. We were there in the fall, so it was a very nice time to see the lovely fall colors and to hang around on the beaches with nobody there, because that time of year is great for coastal bird watching, both for ocean birds and also marsh wetland birds that are in wetlands, like herons, like this one. We also went a little bit west towards Rhode Island. It's worth exploring that area because it's very different. Across, if you go past west past New Bedford into Dartmouth, Westport, and even if you cross into Rhode Island, where Little Compton and Tiverton are, there are very beautiful landscapes. It's a much more, it's like a shallow plateau that kind of rolls slowly down to the sea with very long vistas. And a lot of, again, very beautiful little towns and very luxurious seaside mansions. This is one of the biggest anywhere in the country, actually. This is called Round Hill Mansion. It's in Dartmouth. You can't actually visit it. It was built in the 1920s after World War I by the only son of Hetty Green. And I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She was the country's richest woman at the time. And he inherited from her, her only child, inherited, it's estimated between $100 and $200 million, which you can imagine what that would be worth today in today's dollars. And he built this massive, if kind of blocky, mansion right on the water. And it's been used for various purposes over the last 100 years. But right now, it's been turned into private condos, if you can believe it. So it is no longer possible to go in. You can see it from a distance away and from the water if you're on a boat, but you can't actually get up close to the house. But it's quite impressive even from afar. So this whole area, I would really encourage that you explore it, because even on a day trip, if you don't want to stay overnight, you can easily be down in the Buzzards Bay area in an hour and a half. Get up early, go down there, explore a little bit, look at, have lunch, go to the beach, maybe take a day trip somewhere, and you're back in Boston by early evening if you want to. Staying overnight makes it even better, because then you can actually plan a little bit to see some more stuff. Let me take a quick look at questions. Have I been to Mystic, Connecticut? I have, but not in a very long time. That's a place I should go to again. I don't think I've been, considering how close it is, I don't think I've been to Mystic since I was probably in high school. But I'd love to go back because there's so much to do there, particularly with the whole Seaport Museum and stuff. But I don't really have a sense as an adult of what it's like. So I'll put that on my list. Someone also asked who is taking the ferry to and from Cuddington each day. The ferry, it definitely varies at the time of year. We were there in the fall, so the ferry runs, I'm trying to remember at that time of year, at least once a day. And it runs, the most popular season, of course, is in the summer. But even during the winter, the ferry has to go because not everybody has a private boat, and there are residents, and they need supplies brought back and forth. And as you mentioned in the question, there are workers, tourists, obviously, take the boat back and forth, but more in the summer. Tourism in the winter is almost non-existent. Fall and spring to some degree. But you're right, it's a little bit of everything. Workers, residents who don't have their own boats, and visitors. We're now going to move on to the opposite end of the state, to the Pioneer Valley. So this is just east of the Berkshires. It's not really quite in the Berkshires yet, but it's in the Connecticut River Valley. And the Pioneer Valley is the name for an area that is made up of Hampden County, parts of Hampden County, parts of Hampshire County, and parts of Franklin. And actually, Franklin County is the least populous of all of the counties in Massachusetts. There's only 70,000 people in the whole county. And we stayed in Shelburne Falls, which is right here. You can see the Connecticut River coming down through the middle, and the Quabbin Reservoir off to the east. But I'm going to show you a number of other areas that are within this. And again, it's you're never more than an hour away from anything by car, and along the way, it's just beautiful scenery. We stopped at a place called Mount Toby, which is a state forest in the town of Sunderland. It's about 800 acres with a peak that's about 1,300 feet high, and it has a lot of really nice hiking trails with a fire tower that you can climb all the way to the top for really nice views. But one of the things we wanted to see was this little geological oddity called the Sunderland Caves. They're not really caves. It's just an interesting rock formation where the rocks have split apart. These are big granite outcrops, but you can actually kind of squeeze in between them. It's very dark and cold inside, but it makes kind of a fun place. If you have kids, it's a fun place to take kids because it's relatively safe, but still kind of cool to explore inside the dark little caverns. You do need a flashlight if you want to go all the way through. And the entire valley around here is just beautiful. Very close by is Mount Sugarloaf in South Deerfield, which has just a picture-perfect view of the Connecticut River Valley. That's what we're seeing here, looking south. The Mount Holyoke Range is the hills that you can see off in the distance. And of course, because this is the very lush Connecticut River Valley, it has a lot of very good soil and very good clay. So it's long been an important part of agriculture in New England. And just here are some views. You can walk and or drive, depending on the traffic, to the top of Mount Sugarloaf. And there are views in all directions, including down to the farmland down below. There's a short hiking trail, maybe 20 minutes or so to get up to the top. And there's also a paved road, which is a little easier. It takes longer, but it's a much shallower road. And this is a view of the town of Sunderland right across the river with the valley around. And more views of the farmland. We were lucky to be there on a very beautiful day with very clear weather. And in fact, looking back east across the river, you can see Mount Toby, where we just were, where the rock caves were. And again, if the weather is clear, you can see all the way to Amherst, where the University of Massachusetts is. You can see a number of the buildings of UMass here, 5 miles to the south of South Deerfield. And I want to take you back up to Shelburne, where we stayed. And here, just to give you a sense of the topography around it. This is actually not the Connecticut River. Shelburne is on the Deerfield River, which eventually joins the Connecticut River in Greenfield. We'll see that later. And Shelburne is just past Greenfield on what's called the Mohawk Trail, which is the highway, old local road that goes all the way out to Williamstown, way in the far northwest corner of the state. What's funny about Shelburne Falls is it's not actually a separate town. It's a village of about 1,700 people. And it's split between 2 separate municipalities. On one side is the town of Shelburne, and on the other side is the town of Buckland. And Shelburne Falls is actually, it seems like it's its own place, but it's actually split between those 2 separate towns. There's a nice fire tower if you go up to the mountain just above the town here. There's a fantastic view out over the town and the river valley. But the town of Shelburne Falls has a very nice, charming historic district with a lot of restored buildings. There's some great cafes and shops with crafts and so forth. And some very nice old commercial buildings that have been restored. And of course, the focus is on the river, with a couple of bridges that cross it. The main vehicle bridge, which you would drive over now, is from the 1890s. And right below that is the dam, where there are a number of glacial potholes worn in the river. You can kind of see them. It was hard to see on this day because we were there right after some recent rainstorms. So the river was actually thundering over the dam. If the water isn't quite as high, you can see the potholes that have been carved out by boulders that grind against the stone. That's a little bit more visible when the water isn't so high. And Shelburne is probably best known for what's called the Bridge of Flowers, which was originally built as a trolley bridge. And then when the trolley stopped, they converted it, rather than demolishing the bridge, they covered it with plantings. And of course, we were there in the fall, so the season has gone. But between May and really through early October, the entire bridge is completely covered with flowers. So because we were there a little bit later, the flowers were gone, but they had decorated it with holiday decorations, which was also kind of nice. Again, yet another public library. And like the towns that I was showing you down on the South Coast, Shelburne has some really nice architecture, mixes of all different kinds of interesting commercial and residential buildings in a typical New England town. And here you can see the lights at night with the flower bridge decorated for the holidays. The tradition of decorating the bridge started about 100 years ago, after they discontinued the trolleys. And if you're interested in trolleys, if you like old trains and stuff like that, there is actually a little trolley museum, if you're interested, that talks about the history of them in the town. And again, we stayed in an Airbnb. This is not it, but it's a house across the street from where we stay, another Gothic revival, interestingly enough. As is this one, even more impressive. And I climbed up to an Audubon sanctuary. Mass Audubon has some hiking trails on the hilltop above Shelburne Falls. So not only are there very beautiful trails, but you have really nice views over the town. You can see all the way back down to where the river is, where most of the town is located, and the two bridges, the Bridge of Flowers and also the current road bridge. And you can see for miles from the, if you climb up to the top of the fire tower, there's beautiful views all over the Pioneer Valley and looking out west towards all the way out west towards the Berkshire Hills. We also took some just driving trips around this area. The Pioneer Valley has a lot of nice little towns. This is in Conway. Conway has less than 2,000 people, but an adorable little downtown with an amazing little library with this big copper dome. There's a number of old historic covered bridges in the region, like this one. And lots of beautiful churches. This one's in Coleraine, another little town that has fewer than 2,000 people in it. And just luscious farmland with very rich soil. The whole Connecticut River Valley is very well irrigated from the river, and the soil is particularly good for crops. Buckland, which is the town where part of Shelburne Falls is located, is a very nice town. It has a very beautiful little historic center with some unusual old historic buildings in it, like this one, and a church. The Congregational Church is named for Mary Lyon, who was a woman who founded Mount Holyoke College. She was a native of Buckland, and it has 6 absolutely beautiful stained glass windows from the first decade of the 1900s. And they have a restoration campaign right now trying to raise money to restore them. And also a beautiful little cemetery, a public library, of course. But I liked Buckland because although there's a main road that goes through the valley. Um, the downtown district of Buckland is actually on a little side street, so it gets very little traffic and has is peaceful and atmospheric without a lot of cars running through it. Typical New England farmland. When we spend, those of us who are living and spending most of our time in the very developed area around Boston tend to forget that Massachusetts does have quite a bit of agriculture, small scale, to be sure, compared to the Midwest, but you don't have to actually go very far to see this. I do see a question too in the Q&A. Someone's asking if tobacco is still grown in the Connecticut River Valley. No, but I have to say, I remember as a child, my mother's family was all from Connecticut, so we spent a lot of time when I was a child driving down to visit my mother's relatives who were in kind of central Connecticut around the Hartford area. And I remember back in those days when you drove down, there were tobacco farms as far as the eye could see. And they were they were big in that part of Connecticut, surprisingly, perhaps because the river valley was perfect for growing tobacco. It's very hot in the summer, very humid in the valley, and it's a very dark, rich red clay that you would, when you look at it, you would swear you were in the deep south, but it was in Connecticut. And these days, most of that, there's no tobacco growing anymore. And in fact, much of that land has unfortunately been turned over to development. So now a lot of it is more suburban developments and residential areas. When we were there, there was actually a lot of lousy weather. And that's okay, because when you're driving around, it still is quite pretty, even in the fog. Oh, somebody is mentioning, I did not know this, somebody's mentioning there is tobacco farming still in the valley. She mentions Hatfield. I didn't know that. That's good to know. Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, even in the fog, it's just a beautiful landscape. Particularly we were there in, when were we there? November. So this is after the fall leaves have all disappeared, but it still can be quite atmospheric. There's a lot of, if you've ever taken the Mohawk Trail, there's a lot of interesting roadside stuff along that. It's if you don't know, it's a 63-mile road that was opened in 1914, goes back that far, and was the first official scenic route in Massachusetts. And it follows all the way out. If you follow Route 2 and keep going more or less across the top part of the state, you end up in the far northwest corner. So in addition to a lot of beautiful scenery, there's a lot of roadside stuff to see as well. Here's another wonderful covered bridge. Unfortunately, this is a modern replica. The original bridge, which was built in the 1800s, had to be completely reconstructed, but you can still drive through it. This is in the town of Charlemont. Another view of that. And it's worth it also if you're in this area to stop at Deerfield, which is very well known. I'm sure many of you have probably been there at some point or at least heard of it. Deerfield is a town, and in terms of land area, it's huge. It's quite a large geographical area along the Deerfield River. But the highlight nowadays is historic Deerfield, which was started back in the 1930s, roughly, by a couple named Henry and Helen Flint. Their son was at Deerfield Academy, which still exists. Deerfield Academy has about private school with about 600 students in it. And the Flints created a collection of historic properties along what is the roughly 1.5 mile length of the original old Main Street of the town. And 11 of those buildings now are open as museums. This is a tavern, the Barnard Tavern from 1795. And of course, unfortunately, there were two things wrong with the day I went there. One, it was pouring rain, and two, it was COVID. So I have actually earlier in my life, I have been to Deerfield when it was open, and I would enjoy going back, particularly if the weather was better. But even on a rainy day, it was a beautiful way to just get out and explore some historic scenery. This is the Wilson Printing Office. And the restoration of the houses is just spectacular. This unusual blue is actually a historic color. It gets a lot of comments because of how strikingly bright it is. This is the Wells Thorne House, which was built in 1747. And it definitely stands out, particularly right next to a completely different style of much earlier architecture. But all of historic Deerfield makes you feel like you're really going back in time. And if you have the chance to be there when it's open, it's it's akin to historic Williamsburg, places like that where they have really brought to life the time period that all of these buildings were built in and the uses that they were put to. The Flints also collected a lot of decorative arts. So many of the buildings, this house here was originally in Springfield, Massachusetts, was built in the 1750s, and it was moved all the way to Deerfield, where it fits quite nicely in with the rest of the streetscape. And behind it, that big building in the back, is the Flint's collection of decorative arts. They had quilts and household goods and implements and textiles and clothing and all kinds of things. So if you're interested in early American crafts and decorative arts, Deerfield has a superb collection of that. So even in COVID, when I couldn't visit the various house museums, it's just a magnificent assemblage of these well-preserved homes. And just walking the street is an experience. Even if you can't go inside, the exterior details are beautiful. This looks like a gift shop, but it's not. It is actually the post office, and it is still a working post office that accepts and distributes mail. Definitely from a later area, and I think it's the only one in Deerfield, this is yet another Gothic revival house, way up at the top of the street. And exploring a little bit more around this area, there's just lots of little towns. I liked this little one is called Hawley, just west of Buckland. There are fewer than 350 people in Hawley, and this is pretty much the center of town. Another little beautiful church. Again, for those of us who are in Chelmsford or other towns on the North Shore or the Boston area, we forget that Western Mass is really quite different. Central and Western Mass. There are a lot of very small towns with very small populations and a very different style of life from suburban Boston. One natural outdoor site that's fun to visit is the Chesterfield Gorge, which is a very easy hike. It's in the town of Chesterfield, another small town with only about 1,200 people in it. And the gorge is part of the Trustees of Reservations. If you're familiar with them, the trustees own a huge number of properties across Massachusetts, both historic homes and also natural uh, uh, outdoor landscapes, as well as their center up in Ipswich, where Crane Beach and the Crane Estate are located. But Chesterfield Gorge is a very dramatic little gorge. And again, at the time that we were there, this was not long after there had been some pretty heavy rains. So the river was at its height. And the trail, it's not a very strenuous trail. It follows the cliff top for a ways and then down, and you follow along the, this is the Westfield River, and you follow along the banks for quite a ways. It's very deep woods. There's very few people, or at least there were when I was there. And particularly in the lush fall, there were, it was just full of moss and trees, and you could almost convince yourself you were in the Pacific Northwest. But the river was very turbulent at the time that I was there. Another little town along the way, this is a church in Williamsburg, not Williamstown, Williamsburg. They're different. And on the right is the town of Goshen with its little public library. Williamsburg, Massachusetts has its own little historic district called Haydenville, which is one of the oldest parts of the town. And they, along Route 135, there's a whole collection of really beautiful houses, some of which are quite immense and elaborate. This one looked like it could use a little tender loving care. And it even has, of course, its own tiny library, which of course was closed at the time we were there, but I took a peek inside and I just love this, the inside of this library. The librarian's desk, she has a laptop and just a few comfy chairs in one little room. I have it as a goal to eventually visit all the public libraries in Massachusetts. And these really didn't count because I wasn't able to go inside. But I should put that back on my to-do list. Circling around, I'm actually kind of making a counterclockwise circle in this valley. And as I was heading back to Northampton, this is Florence, which is technically not a separate town. It's part of Northampton, but it does have its own identity and its own kind of culture and history, and its own public library. This is the little Florence Public Library. The reason it's called Florence is a century or so ago, it actually had a big silk industry for a while, and it was named after the famous city in Tuscany, Florence, Italy, which also was known for its silk. So that's where it gets its name. But Northampton proper, of course, which is a major center in the area, it's, I want to guess around 30,000 people at this point. It's a pretty good sized place. And in fact, it's the county seat for Hampshire County. And Smith College, which you can see here, is a major presence there. And this is the very highly regarded Forbes Public Library. The town is ranked as, even by Massachusetts standards, it's definitely one of the most politically liberal towns for its size. You can kind of think of it as the Cambridge of Western Mass. And right across the river, across the Connecticut River, back to the east in Amherst, is the town of Amherst, which also has a very beautiful and busy downtown. It's even bigger than Northampton, although you wouldn't necessarily think so, but I think it's got close to 40,000 people these days. And it's home to 3 of the 5 colleges in the area. Amherst College, Hampshire College, and UMass Amherst are all located in Amherst. And of course, UMass, being the largest with 30,000 some odd students, has a major effect on the area. But the town itself still has kind of a small town feel. And there's some very beautiful old homes, including this particular one, which is well worth visiting if you're into literature. This is the Emily Dickinson Museum. It's hard to tell, but this house is actually made of brick. It's painted, but it was the first brick house built in Amherst in 1813, and it was her birthplace where Emily Dickinson, the poet, was born, and it was for her home for a very long time. And it is now a museum that you can visit. And just next door, this Italianate mansion called Evergreens is a home that belonged to Emily Dickinson's brother, right next door. Now for something completely different, I'm going to take you back. We're circling back up to Shelburne, up the valley through a town, the town of Leverett. And you would never guess that there is a pagoda. This is a Buddhist stupa, and it's a retreat. This is called the New England Peace Pagoda. And you can visit it. It was the first such pagoda built in the United States in 1985. And they have retreats. And even if you want to just stop and wander around the grounds, it's a very beautiful and peaceful location with they have a water garden and some paths it's off in the woods. Very peaceful location and completely surprising in this part of the state. And another kind of fun thing to do in this area, also in Leverett, is something called the Rattlesnake Gutter, which I had never heard of. But I was looking for places to hike, and it's kind of it's a little off the beaten path, but it's a relatively easy hike. It's not terribly strenuous, through a chasm that is filled with boulders. It's almost about a mile long. So it's, if you go down one end and go all the way back, it would be 2 miles. You can park at either end. And there are, the landscape is just incredible. Because so much of New England is, the geology comes from glaciers, the retreat of glaciers millennia ago. They think that this particular pile of boulders is the result of a burst of glacial meltwater that cascaded down the ravine and just carried all these massive rocks with it and then piled them up on top of each other. But it makes a very nice place to go hiking. Very dramatic landscape, and it's great if you're not looking for a very strenuous hike, but want something that's a fairly interesting place to go. Particularly in the fall, it has almost a creepy feel to it. And it can get very dark because the chasm is so narrow with all these tall trees. And then again, working our way back up the valley, I stopped in Greenfield, which is the county seat of Little Franklin County, with about 18,000 people. So, like, in other words, roughly 25% of the total county population lives right in Greenfield. And it has a very nice downtown. It's a little rough around the edges, although it's improving. And it's right at the confluence of the Deerfield River and the Connecticut River, which come together here. There's a big hill on the east side of town, and you can see the tower here, which is called Poet's Seat, built in 1912 in a public park that overlooks the city and the river. And it's so named because back in the day, poets were supposedly coming up here for inspiration. And it certainly is a beautiful spot to sit, particularly late in the afternoon when you can watch the sunset over the Berkshire Hills in the distance. And you get a nice view of the city of Greenfield down at the bottom. And so after this trip was over, we headed back east along the corridor along Route 2, along the northern stretch through a number of the towns on the New Hampshire border. This is a town called Leiden, named after the Leiden in the Netherlands. There's only 700 people here. And downtown really has almost nothing in it except the fire department, a little town hall, and one of my favorite public libraries in all of Massachusetts. Another one of these little one-room libraries. I just love the fact that they have these Adirondack chairs where you can sit with a book and look out over the valley. We also stopped in Northfield, where there's the interestingly named Satan's Kingdom wildlife area, which is another beautiful spot with ponds and hiking trails. Massachusetts is loaded with different landscapes. Some are state parks, some are town forests, some are privately owned, like from the trustees of reservations. But there's a wealth of different kinds of natural landscapes to explore. For such a small state, we're very lucky to have all of those so close to us. Again, here in Northfield, Northfield is home to Northfield Mount Herman, which is a prep school. It's a very nice little town right on the New Hampshire border. Has a very wide main street with some nice old buildings. This was one of the nicer ones. It's an old 1846 house that's kind of a weird mix of Greek revival and Gothic revival smushed into each other. And another wonderful church buried deep in the woods. This was an unusual church in that it was not on a common and not in the center of town. And honestly, I forget which town it was in. I think it was either Warwick or Irving, one of those towns along the north border of the state. And we also stopped in Orange, named for William, Prince of Orange, which is a little bit bigger, around 8,000, with a nice downtown. Was once a major producer of sewing machines. And so they do have a few nice buildings from back in the day when it was a fairly wealthy little town. And you can see the town hall on the right. And they also had a number of these beautiful little fountains, water fountains. This is just an ordinary water bubbler like you'd find anywhere, but it was put there by the Women's Christian Temperance Union back in 1904, I guess, to encourage people to drink water instead of alcohol. And some really amazing houses in the downtown historic district. Here's the Historical Society and some commercial buildings as well. I liked some of these. And this completely extravagant Queen Anne pile of in this fantastic orange color. I'm going to end the program with a very fun day trip that is only about an hour from here. It's in the town of Sutton, which is just south of Worcester. It's just off Route 146. And it's called Purgatory Chasm. You can visit it pretty much all year. I think it would, during the deepest of winter, it wouldn't be any fun because it would be probably more dangerous when things are snowy and icy. But it's quite literally a chasm. It's about a quarter mile long and up to, maybe 70 feet deep. You can see it here on a topographical map. Even during COVID, we were able to go there because once things had started to open up a little bit and they were letting people go out, outdoor activities were permitted. We did have to be masked and try to keep distance and so forth. But the day we went, it was crowded with people who were just so desperate to get out of lockdown and get out into nature. It's a fairly early state park for Massachusetts, 1919. And like the other chasm that I showed you a few minutes ago, this one was also probably glacial, where it's possible that they think an ice dam that was holding back a lot of glacier water, ice, and rocks, boulders, burst thousands of years ago and just cascaded down and ripped open this chasm and left this incredible landscape of boulders, huge boulders, granite boulders with cliffs and caves underneath them. It's great fun for anybody who likes to climb and clamber over stuff, especially kids. There's interesting trees like this with roots that have grown in between all of the rocks. But it's just a remarkable landscape. And you can see just how dramatic some of the rock formations are, where they've been split by tree roots, by ice, by water. This particular one is called the Fat Man's Misery for obvious reasons. It's a very narrow cleft that's barely even like 18 inches wide, but you might be able to squeeze through it. And if you do, that's what it looks like to look straight up. There's also a really wonderful flat rock that you can, all the kids were sliding down. And they have picnic areas and so forth. So if you've never been, this was one of those things as I've heard of and never got around to going because it was just far enough away that I had to think about planning it. So we were very glad that we did it a couple of years ago, and I would definitely go back because you could spend the whole day there between the picnic areas and all the different things to explore. So I'm going to end the program there, and I'll stop my screen share and take a look at any questions. I only see one remaining question. Let's see. Oh, interesting. So to whoever put the question in the Q&A about, I guess the photograph that I took on Cuttyhunk of the cemetery has one of your ancestors in it. That's kind of surprising. If you would like that photo, feel free to let me know and I can email it to you. I will put my email in the chat. If any of you have any questions, let's see, whoops. Yeah, okay. I'm also going to just double check some of the let's see. Don't see any additional questions that I missed, looks like. So yes, I just put my email in the chat. If you have any questions, do feel free to contact me. And for the person who was interested in the tombstone, definitely email me because I would be happy to send you that photograph if you're interested in it. So I hope those of you who haven't been to these places will get a chance at some point to go visit them because they're a lot of fun and they're, like I said, they're all very close by. And now that we don't have to worry about COVID restrictions, you would be able to see a lot more than I did during 2020. And I'm looking forward to going back and exploring more of our state as well. Sometime actually this summer would be a good time to do it.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. I didn't see any additional questions either. If anyone has any last minute, otherwise, I look forward to having you back again. This was a great one, I think, for our summer trips. I'm looking forward to some quick weekend trips. So thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for coming, and I will probably see you at some program either later this summer or in the fall.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.